Welcome to the St. Louis University Craft Talks, part of the St. Louis Literary Award series of programming with our host, Ted Iber, and special guest, Ted Mathys. The St. Louis Literary Award was created by the Library Associates of St. Louis University in 1967. To learn more about the Literary Award and the writers that we have honored over the years, check out the book The St. Louis Literary Award by St. Louis University Archivist Emeritus John Wade. We would also like to thank our sponsors for the Craft Talk series, Left Bank Books and Caldy's Coffee Roasting Company. Left Bank Books is one of the oldest and largest independently owned bookstores in the nation, offering a full line of new and used books, gifts, cards, magazines, toys, and services. You can order works by Ted Mathys at a 20% discount if you let them know that you saw this interview. Caldy's Coffee Roasting Company is dedicated to creating a memorable coffee experience for their customers and guests, committing to sustainable business practices, providing educational opportunities, and supporting the communities in which they serve. And now, without further ado, Ted Mathys.
Welcome to St. Louis University's Craft Talks, part of the St. Louis Literary Award series of programs. My name is Ted Iber, and I'm the Executive Director of the St. Louis Literary Award. I'm really excited to kick off our Craft Talk series with one of our own, Ted Mathys, Assistant Professor of Creative Writing in the English Department at St. Louis University. Ted is also President of the prestigious and venerable St. Louis Poetry Center, which is even older than the Literary Award, dating back all the way to 1946. And as if that is not enough, Ted is also the curator for the 100 Boots Poetry Series, a program that I'll actually be asking you about more in the talk, Ted. So thank you so much for being here, and congratulations on the release of your brand new collection of poetry from the new book, Gold Cure, published by Coffee Press, which I also have right here, marked up completely and ruined for anybody else who wants to read it.
Thanks so much for having me, Ted. I look forward to this.
So we're going to be talking about craft and style and process and more. And I just thought we should just jump right in. And I'm going to ask you if you would read a couple selections from Gold Cure from the El Dorado section. And just for our viewers to note, the book is split into 5 different sections or movements. And El Dorado, I see, is listed twice. So I had selected the poems Goldfish and Voyager from El Dorado 1.
Great. Well, again, thank you so much. And I'm really excited to be here to talk about craft, to think through poetry writing for the St. Louis University community of students and faculty and library and friends. This book, as you mentioned, Ted, just came out from Coffee House Press. It has a number of figurations of gold that run throughout it, both as a kind of heavy metal and physical object, but also the idiomatic expressions of gold in American culture are sort of meditated upon throughout. The sections that you mentioned, El Dorado, refer, for those that might not know, to this mythic city of gold, reputed to be somewhere in South America during the 16th century, for conquistadors and others sought the El Dorado, the city of gold, which of course didn't exist and led to a number of kind of horrible outcomes for people that lived in the areas that were being explored. So I'm just going to read these 2 poems you asked from the first El Dorado section. This one's called Goldfish. Sometimes a ping pong ball ricochets in the improbable honeycomb of fish bowls, lip, lip, before rimming out. And you are grateful to physics for saving you from having to adopt a distressed carnival pet and send your child off on her first slow pilgrimage to grief. But sometimes a package deal leaves you stuck with a full bucket of balls. You put a little English on a throw, and the wind's sorcery provides a direct hit. The splash unnerving the skittish creature your child declares is a girl named Marvin. $80 later, Marvin is in an aquarium on your child's dresser, darting in all that water, all that LED light. Sometimes diagnoses of shock proliferate for one who no longer recognizes the system in which she lives. Lack of appetite, bottom sitting, black spots, skin flukes, a decline from golden sheen to sallow white, until a protective impulse grows animal in your core. Sometimes there's a protest on the radio when you enter your child's room to retrieve her ladybug rain boots and find your spouse in her bathrobe sitting on the bed, watching Marvin swallow a descending flake, and there's no need to ask why.
Thank you for that.
Okay, and then the next one, it also happens to be the one that follows it in the book. It's called Voyager. This poem has, it has a reference to the Voyager Golden Record, which was launched by NASA in 1978, and is still floating in deep space. So there's that reference, and then another golden record, which you'll hear about. Voyager. Digging for vinyl in the Goodwill dollar bin, I discover a record called Poet's Gold. Produced mid-century by RCA, it has Yeats and Kipling, Keats and Millay, recited with pomposity by a tenebrous voice. When sleep resists, I implode on the sofa and listen to poems through pop and hiss, time and dust. I imagine what I would have included on the other golden record launched by NASA the year of my birth. Millennia after I'm dead, the golden record will pass within a light year of an obscure constellation shaped like a giraffe to pose an interpretive problem to another intelligence. Poet's Gold fades into silence like a thesis, and the golden record drifts away from me faster than sleep. But its problem of audience lingers to include laughter, a dictator, whale song, or hello in 50 languages, to notate in the grooves Beethoven, a hydrogen atom, to diagram a fern. If my brain waves were recorded, would I have the discipline to conceptualize devotion, and to what ideal? Or would the EEG register associative leaps? How the sound of a knuckle cracking underwater is the click of an electric fence, like the one I stood behind while a man I'd once known put down a sick cow with a sledge to the skull. How the arc of his swing was that of an axe bisecting firewood propped up on a stump, its two halves newly exposed to each other and falling away in opposite directions like a gunman from the kick and the victim from impact, or my head to this cushion and a record to the stars.
Fantastic. Thank you for reading those.
Yeah.
I've always been fascinated, and I think it's a great writing prompt actually to do with writing students about what sounds would you put on a golden record that would be launched into space now. I would definitely have some ideas.
Yeah.
All right, so you kind of addressed this, but I'm gonna ask the question in a slightly different way. So gold, both obviously literally and metaphorically, is a running theme throughout this collection of poems. So if you could talk a little bit about your own connection to gold, maybe what the writer Richard Hugo referred to as a trigger, like points of entries into the realm of imagination. Gold is clearly a trigger for you. What about gold initially inspired you as a writer to have create such a gorgeous and diverse compilation of poems that also has such a dynamic range in form and subject? Right.
So as with many writers, sometimes these patterns of poems that all turn around an individual subject come through serendipity, and then the metaphors start to fill themselves out. In my case, I was interested in reading about elements, and I had been thinking about the different ways in which elements figure our lives. I was reading a cultural history of the elements. And as I got to the sort of gold chapters, the sort of pervasiveness of gold, not just as a heavy metal and an element, but also as a cultural ideal, started to really fascinate me. At the same time, the current president was elected. And in those early days, I was reminded of his complete obsession with gold, right? He has the gold trimmed helicopter, and then seeing in the White House, the press briefing rooms with those golden drapes and his kind of like weird fake golden hair. And so he, to me, represented like all of the kind of horrific instantiations of gold as ostentation and accumulation and exploitation and murderousness, at the same time as I was, like looking at my wife's golden wedding ring. So I'm thinking like, what is this, And I didn't want gold in this book to have stability as a metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I'm often attracted to, like John Donne or all of these poets that I just revere that find in opposites, dualities, and paradoxes really the place of poetry. And for me, gold is definitely that.
One of the things that struck me as well reading the book, and it reminded me of just as you're talking, one of the things I've told students over and over again, no matter what genre they're working in, creative nonfiction or poetry, drama, no matter what it is, there's going to be a significant research component that's attached to it. But it was clear to me that you had to have read an amazing amount of material to get these poems written. It just struck me as you had to have done a lot of research, which for me is like half the fun as well.
Yeah, well, and for me, research takes different forms. Some of it is book research, but that's actually the smallest part. I have a poem in the book called Gold Dredge. I spend my summers often in Portland, Oregon, and I drive between St. Louis and Oregon, on the way out and then back. And one of my friends in Oregon was like, oh, if you're going to pass through Eastern Oregon near Baker City, there's this old abandoned gold dredge, which is really weird. It's like people think it's haunted. It's just like buried in this valley. There's nothing there. So that kind of research for me is like when I get an idea like that, I went to the gold dredge, and you pick up a few pamphlets along the way, but really experiencing your subject matter. Or I went down into the bottom of a gold mine in Colorado, or this goldfish poem I read was just simply a carnival that the Wash U fraternities and sororities put on every year.
Sure.
And we went there, and we had a little kid, and my spouse was like, oh, let's win her a goldfish, and of course then you have to, because the child has heard it. And then you win the goldfish, and then all of a sudden you're in this moment where the entire political moment seems to make sense through this slowly dying goldfish.
Yeah.
So the research takes place in books, yes, but kind of more so in experience.
Yeah, sure. So, all right, some questions on writing process. Now, you've got a variety of degrees in some pretty fascinating areas. I know that you hold an MA in law and diplomacy and an MA in environmental policy. And in addition, you've got an MFA from the University of Iowa Writers Workshop. So it's clear to see that these issues are a concern, that you have issues, that you've got a concern about the environment and the world, which inspires your work, especially Gold Cure, which addresses, among other things, gold mining and fracking. Can you talk about what's driven your pursuit of these kinds of programs and elaborate on the threads that connect to the knowledge, to the body of your work?
Yeah. I grew up on a farm. I grew up in Northeast Ohio, and always had a lot of space. And I think I, like many people, just sort of took natural landscapes for granted. And strangely, it wasn't until I was in my 20s living in New York City that I started to feel alienated from my surroundings and really craving a kind of more basic, immediate relationship to to trees.
Mhm.
So I started getting really interested in reading some of the transcendentalists and camping on the weekends, taking trains up the Hudson River Valley and camping in some of those areas. And around that time, I got interested also in environmental policy. I had been writing and actively publishing as a poet, so those things started to become kind of dual pursuits. I worked in environmental policy here in Missouri as an environmental advocate for a nonprofit that I was helping run for a few years and writing. I used to really find an important division between my literary and political pursuits that over time not only became untenable, because you really got to work 60 hours a week to be an effective environmental advocate. But also because I started to find ways in which the modes of thinking sometimes are actually more complementary than we assume. So for me, a lot of my work has continued to engage with themes around the environment. I don't want my poems to ever, though, become didactic vehicles for change. I don't really necessarily think that pressure should be put on poetry. I think that there are a lot of people doing wonderful work in poetry, but I also think that we need to continue to go to advocate for our issues with our legislators and so forth. So I'm not trying in these poems about fracking or about gold mining to come up with some sort of policy examples. For me, they help me think through our relationship to the surface of the earth. So both fracking and gold mining are things that kind of happen subsurface. They're kind of buried. You can't see them. So there's this visibility and invisibility question that I've been thinking about with these poems in particular.
Obviously the arts have been a vehicle for making things happen, for making change happen, whether it's more subtle or whether it's more overt, in the literary arts, in music, in visual arts performance, all of it.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm gonna switch around a little bit. You said that the title of "Let Muddy Water Sit and It Grows Clear" was taken from a line in the Tao Te Ching. So what other works do you draw inspiration from?
Wow, a lot. It sort of depends on the poem. I have sort of triggers and prompts in this current book from poets as diverse as Hart Crane and Elizabeth Bishop, and a micro essay by Roland Barthes. I recently wrote a short piece for Poets and Writers magazine. They were asking poets to kind of recommend a kind of process or inspirational thing to help people when they're feeling dry. And I was really trying to be honest with myself about how influence works for me. And while I have favorite poets and poets that I return to and poets that have been really important to me, I find that when I'm actually in the process of writing, I do this thing that's kind of like grazing. I'll often surround myself with an archive of books that have nothing to do with each other. So it might be like a book of theory and 3 contemporary poetry books and Ovid and a novel. And I will start flipping through them sort of quickly. And I'm not looking for any kind of content. I'm basically looking for either an interesting syntactical arrangement or a rhythm, or sometimes an individual word. Like the other day I was flipping through something, I saw the word buttermilk. And I just thought, that's a perfect noun. Buttermilk is probably like one of my favorite nouns. It's got that double T in the middle. It sounds great, but it brings to mind this image of this kind of creamy substance, like buttermilk. What a wonderful noun. So sometimes I'm in this grazing process, and I think that I'm not trying to write like any individual person. What I do is I often surround myself with books until a pattern or a syntactic arrangement or a grammatical spark allows me to access what I've been reading about more deeply in other realms.
I love that. I'm actually going to jump to a question I had toward the end of this, but it's relevant. One of the things that I've noticed when reading your work is you've got your level of vocabulary is high. And it reminded me of writers like Annie Proulx and Michael Chabon. And we talk as teachers about the value of word choice to our students. So one of the questions that I often hear from students is do professional writers use a thesaurus? Do they have it parked by them? And so instead of just answering myself, I throw it back at you. Do you use a thesaurus, and how do you feel about it for students?
To be perfectly honest, when I was a younger writer, I did use a thesaurus, and I no longer do. Mm-hmm. So there's always an element of, often poetry, contemporary poets will have a kind of citational quality. So sometimes if I'm interested in a specific term or a specific document, I'll know the, say, scientific name for whatever toxin I'm talking about. But I'm not using the thesaurus to say, I've got this noun and I want to look up a better noun. That's just not something I do. And I'm aware of dangers. I'm aware of the dangers of arc diction. I was weaned on really lush language. One of my first loves was Hart Crane, another poet from Northeast Ohio. And I never knew what the hell Hart Crane was saying about anything. But he had such springiness and tension in his lines, and his diction was very difficult. But I tend to look for phonemes and morphemes and sounds and wind chimes in the language itself, more so than specific words.
Okay, thank you. Following up with process and craft, how do you title your pieces? How do you make a decision on titles, and do you wait until you're done with the piece before you title it?
The second answer first, yes, usually,
Okay.
but not always. And I'm drawn to simple titles. My 4 books, the first one is titled Forge. The second one is The Spoils. The third is Null Set. And this one is Gold Cure. So they've never been more than 2 words. And then most of my poems, unless again, there's some kind of, like let muddy water sit and it grows clear is a citation. So it's a little longer, but other than that, I tend to think that my titles are usually really short, a word or 2. And for me, titling is, I work with my students on this, it's an opportunity. Sometimes a title can just radically throw a poem in one direction or another. And I think sometimes we also try to work our heads in difficult ways around titles doing encapsulating work. A title doesn't always need to encapsulate. In fact, sometimes a title can provide friction through being an opposite valence of what's happening in the rest of the poem. I'm trying to think of good examples of this, but I think for me, titling often comes after, and I think of it as an opportunity rather than an encapsulation.
Nice. Do you have any specific writing rituals or habits that you follow?
So I tend to write in bursts. I tend to have almost, a kind of mania when I'm in the early sort of gestational phases of thinking through something. So I don't know if this is a healthy practice, but it's an honest answer, which is I tend to write in these huge bursts and then put it aside and wait and then go back and get more intentional about it. Last summer, I'm working on a novel in verse now. And last summer, it's a 12-chapter arc. It's based on the mythological labors of Heracles. And there's 12 of them. And so last summer I wrote like 6 chapters in a month and a half, and I've written a chapter and a half since then. So I have these kind of ebbs and flows. But other than that, my rituals are really based in at least having a night, often 2 nights, that are blocked out every week where nothing else will get in the way of it. And then I kind of write periodically throughout the days, and then in these larger bursts. So I don't have a kind of, here's my happy closet where I turn on a light and I sit there every day from 8 to 10 a.m. I'm not that kind of writer, so maybe I should become that kind of writer.
Well, following up on that, there are writers who find the first draft, the rough draft, to be the most joyful process, and others the exact opposite, which would be me. I'm all about the revision more so than the initial draft.
Yeah.
Where do you fall on that?
Well, so I like the revisions, and it took me a long time to figure out a process that works for me. And I've suggested this to some of my students. I think sometimes with poetry, because there's this house of cards quality to it, where if you remove a word or a line, the whole thing seems to change or collapse, right? Because you're working in this highly condensed art form. And so I think students sometimes get afraid of it, and things become precious, and it's harder to make radical edits. So one thing that I've done in my own writing and encourage them to do is, if you have, like a 30-line lyric poem, we all save things, even if some people are writing on typewriters. Eventually we save them on computers, right? And people print them out. And in the computer, I just save the poem with a title. And if I go back and I want to try something to the poem, if the poem is titled Goldfish, I'll have Goldfish, and then I'll go back and I'll do a revision, and it'll be Goldfish 2, and then I'll do try something else and be Goldfish 3. And for each poem, I usually have a folder that goes somewhere between 3 and 15 versions.
Yeah.
And those versions will sometimes allow me to say, I thought this was a 30-line lyric poem, but in one universe, it's 4 lines, just these 4 lines. And so I'll save that as Goldfish 11. And then after 6 months, I'll go back and look at them and see what the poem is talking to in the manuscript. And maybe the manuscript has other long poems. And I think what I need right now is this spark. And I want a kind of, like tightly wound single image poem. And so maybe I'll choose Goldfish 11. I like poems that have multiple lives, they're all like ghosting themselves. But to revise for me is to, instead of just paring down or just expanding, both of which have been suggested to me by teachers in the past, like trim, or let's just explode this, let's blow this up and make it longer. I kind of tell students to not necessarily do both, but to make things, like reproduce themselves until the right version is saved somewhere in that messy folder.
Yeah. Okay, so on style. In the poem Appellation Trail, you use Maine as a place, but also as an adjective and as a noun. If I may ask you to read Appellation Trail and then talk about the wordplay that you engage in, like, for instance, like Maine, M-A-I-N-E, and M-A-I-N.
Yeah.
So if you have Appellation Trail,
I do.
Handy. Okay.
So this poem is very short. Yeah. Appellation Trail. I am in the Maine on the mend. I am in Maine on the wagon, on Katahdin in an animal skin. I am a pencil maker, breaking a stolen mirror metaphor over the peak to make Maine lakes glint in sun I broke, like a Maine claws over the forest of the page, and paused to drink from a literal canteen. This poem came from a short series that I was writing that eventually appeared, I'll do something funny, eventually appeared in my, not that book, in my last book called Null Set. But they were written initially as a group of poems about about trails, different trails in Missouri, trails that I'd hiked, and they eventually made it into this book called Spurs, which relates to a trail spur. But they're all extremely short, and they're all written in these tiny couplets. I don't know if you can see that. And they tend to have radical enjambment and are interested in puns and wordplay. And I was thinking about the kind of composting or mulching effect of language in relation to the kind of loam or humus of a forest floor, where if you think about what's generative along a trail, it's often the decay of leaves that had one shape into soil that then produces another shape. And so for me, language in this poem gets kind of mulched, and puns are a really great way to think about the multivalent directions that a single word can go. So that's the kind of idea from it. And then it's set on the Appalachian Trail in Maine, near Mount Katahdin. This was also, there's a reference to Henry David Thoreau in here, who once, he was the pencil maker, who basically in his writing about Katahdin stole an image that he had read about in a newspaper that described the lakes from the top of Mount Katahdin, those lakes that you see in Maine, as though someone had shattered a mirror over the top of Katahdin, and the lakes were those shimmering little mirrors. So that's where the line, and I'm in an animal skin, I'm a pencil maker breaking a stolen mirror metaphor over the peak to make Maine lakes glint, right? So there's kind of buried references. So literary history, but also linguistic history.
I imagine if my daughters watch this, they'll be thinking another Ted who's into puns, and then they'll probably flip it off. Sorry. In Vikings Do Not Have Horns on Their Helmets, you negate certain lines and take in some common misconceptions, or take on some common misconceptions, like humans don't have five senses, George Washington didn't have wooden teeth, diamonds are not coal compressed. Can you talk about how you got the idea and what it means to you?
Oh, man. Yeah, that's another poem from this book that came out in 2015. I was interested, yeah, in Null Set. I was interested in what is opened up by negation. And I'm looking at the poem now. There are these philosophical kind of riddles and paradoxes, like if there's, every rule has an exception, what is the exception to the rule that every rule has an exception, right? And that's a line in the poem. So I got interested in those paradoxes, but really what I think the poem is doing, it takes some common misconceptions, and in fact, that stuff about George Washington's teeth and all, there are some misconceptions in there.
Oh, absolutely.
And it lists all of them. It lists all of them as direct statements and negates them, right? But in doing so, it also opens up through incantation and anaphora and repetition the possibility to say very personal things. So in the process of that litany of kind of fun external cultural tidbits, the speaker then also says things like, I do not enjoy being alone, which is actually a very bald, truthful statement. So I like the idea of what is licensed and opened up through negation that can be a kind of direct, truthful, personal utterance that I would be too embarrassed to say in a poem otherwise. So for me, negation became a way to access, or a vehicle to access, other kinds of emotional contours.
I really found it a fascinating poem. So how, for you, and I may have kind of touched on this earlier, you may have, are subject and form related in your work? Does one come before the other, for instance?
There's the Robert Creeley, form is never more than an extension of content, or content is never more than an extension of form. Like there's always a relationship between them. I tend to find forms, whether they're in forms that I invent, nonce forms that I invent, or inherited forms like the sonnet. I find them generative in that sometimes constraint can occupy some of the intentional aspects of the writer's mind to allow that, to shorten that umbilical cord between the imagination and the page. So paradoxically, sometimes the more I constrain myself, the freer I feel to just let what happens happens. Like I wanted to write some poems about fracking, and left to my own devices, it would have just become sprawling and unwieldy. But luckily, in doing some reading, I realized there are 14 major shale plays or shale deposits in the United States where fracking for oil and natural gas is predominant. And the number 14 for any poet immediately sets off the idea of the sonnet, or the 14ers.
Sure.
And so it was really great for me writing those sonnets. It was very difficult, but it was really great for me to have that kind of formal straitjacket. Terrence Hayes has described the sonnet as like break dancing in a straitjacket, right? it's always kind of a test of the poet's ability. But for me, sometimes it's also, it occupies certain aspects of my analytical mind to allow me to just get more creative with the 14 lines I have.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I often tell students that form often, even though it's can be seen as restrictive or constricting, it often can be liberating too. You know exactly the parameters that you've got to work in, and there's no messing with the rule if you're going to follow. If you're going to write a sonnet, for instance,
right?
Very hardcore, what it is.
And William Wordsworth makes that argument of the kind of liberatory potential, particularly of the sonnet, in this poem called "Nuns Fret Not." Nuns fret not in their convent's narrow room, right? He has this list of different professions, like nuns are not feeling constrained by their convent's narrow room, sort of like the sonnet doesn't constrain, because it's what they do. And so students in their pensive citadels and all of this stuff. So he kind of gives all these examples of people who are happy with constraint. And he says, like these folks, I return to the sonnet's scanty plot of ground, the little space of the sonnet. But he talks about it as a kind of pastime and all of that. I think that's like long been a kind of narrative in traditional forms, that they can provide that like space for you to challenge yourself and to retreat to and do all that. I think one thing that I need to remind myself, and that's interesting, is that it's not the same for everybody. So, contemporary Black poets like Terrence Hayes write about the sonnet as, part prison, part panic closet, right? So it identity matters. For Wordsworth, it was fun to hop into that little room of the sonnet, but it's a little bit different. Constraint looks different for Claude McKay or, Harlem Renaissance writers, or, I really think that it's the relationship between form and freedom is thorny when it comes to the tradition that the writer is drawing on.
Sure. So I'm going to change gears again. So your project, the 100 Boots Poetry Series, started in 2011 as the Fort Gondo compound for the Art Poetry Series, and was launched by the Pulitzer Foundation in 2017. It's brought in award-winning poets from St. Louis and from around the country to present and engage with the community. So what was your inspiration for creating the series, and how has it continued to evolve? And can you also talk about the meaning behind the name 100 Boots?
Sure. I first moved to St. Louis in 2010. And at that time, there were some programs by the St. Louis Poetry Center and some readings at SLU and some readings at WashU and the other academic institutions. But there was no kind of independent series that was bringing together people from the art world and the poetry world. I didn't start the 100 Boots, I didn't start the Fort Gondo compound for the arts series. That was started by Jessica Barron, who was a gallerist and artist, and Jennifer Cronovet, who was at that time a visiting professor at WashU. So the two of them started the Fort Gondo series. I happened to read in the very first reading, which was fun with my friends Chris Martin and Mary Austin Speaker. But after a year or so, Jenny moved to China, and I started to program that series with Jessica Barron. And after a few years, when the Fort Gondo gallery space closed, we were approached by some folks at the Pulitzer who had been coming to our series. And they wanted to continue this idea of how can we bring the visual arts and the literary arts together in a dynamic space. And so we kind of moved the series and reconceived of it in the Pulitzer, which is a wonderful space. And St. Louis is extremely lucky to have the Pulitzer. Our name comes from the artist Eleanor Antin, who was also married to the poet David Antin, that some people may be familiar with. And she had a kind of documentary project called 100 Boots, in which she would arrange 100 boots, so 50 pairs of boots in different public spaces and document them photographically. It's kind of wonderful work. It has this kind of provisional quality of assemblage and togetherness. And so we liked the idea of a poetry reading and an art reading that brings together people in a sense of kind of democratic community in a non-academic space that can be rearranged and provisional and think on our feet. And also it had a kind of, there's a slightly oppositional element to 100 pairs of boots. They're boots, they're not slippers. So for us, it was kind of an homage to Eleanor Antin, but also we liked those valences with the reading series.
All right, so I'm going to finish off with some more writer-specific questions, maybe that students might tend to ask. One would be, what does your inner critic sound like, and how do you silence it? Or do you even have one?
My inner critic is like, I imagine most writers' inner critic, which is you're not good enough, you're never going to be good enough. And I don't know that it's necessary to silence it. I do think that continuing to write and to fail and to write voluminously and throw out is an important part of all of this. One of the reeds of the Orpheus is the kind of traditional Greek figure that stands in for lyric poetry. And Orpheus, when he's leading Eurydice up from the underworld, he looks back, and she's swept back to the underworld. And people read that in many ways. For me, if he's a figure of poetry and he was given the opportunity to go do this because of the power of his poetry, the backward glance is to me self-doubt. And one of the reasons that he fails in the end and has his head ripped off by the Maenads and all of that is that he doubted his poetic powers. And I'm not saying that doubt won't come for writers, it always does, but I think there's a danger in indulging too long in that inner critic, at your own peril. So I think that, continuing to have a recognition that not everything you write is brilliant, but also continuing to produce and throw away is a good practice.
Were you writing in as early as middle school, high school, and was it poetry?
I started writing poetry in high school. I think maybe my sophomore or junior year of high school. I didn't have a particular love of English classes in high school. I liked visual art classes much more. I was like president of our art club, but it was like visual art. I think I kind of wanted to be an artist of some sort, but eventually found that my talents laid with words more than other areas. And I had one really important mentor in college. I was a political science and international relations major and traveled around the world and wanted to be a diplomat and did all this law and diplomacy stuff. And then I took a writing workshop my senior year of college, and he sort of pulled me aside and said, I don't know if you want to do this, but you should and you can. And so that confidence, I think, was really useful for me as an undergraduate.
Yeah, no doubt. Were there any books that you remember, like say from high school, that were particularly influential for you?
Most of the books that I think of as having a great impact on my life were from college.
Uh-huh.
Again, like in high school, and maybe this is a good lesson for your high school students and your junior high students, I would come across a scrap of language in what we were reading from Romeo and Juliet or Julius Caesar in English class in high school, or, read Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde like everyone else. But I think that those are useful texts. But for me, it was in college when I discovered that I didn't know as much as I thought I knew about the world, and that in reading poetry, I could learn to see differently and hear differently and experience language in new ways.
All right, Ted. So I'm a musician, and I'm going to be asking this of every person I interview. I got to ask, what's on your playlist right now? What are you listening to?
Oh man. Well, I honestly, mostly what I listen to is piano music. I'm listening to I'm learning piano with my 7-year-old. So I'm in my 40s, and I've never learned piano before, and we're doing Suzuki piano lessons. So we listen to piano recordings daily of simple like French children's songs and things. So there's been a lot of that. In my free time, I've been also listening to kind of some durational music while I'm writing, Philip Glass and others. But I haven't been as much into contemporary or pop music as I should be. I don't know. I don't have a good answer for it.
Yeah, it's okay. Do you listen to music when you're writing?
Yeah, sometimes. I have a hard time with lyrics. So it's usually just instrumental. But yeah, I do occasionally. I don't when I run though. Everybody when they run, they listen to music, and for me, running is the time when I just want to hear the birds twittering.
Oh yeah, no, I there's power in that for sure, but I definitely I need music. All right, here it is, the last question. So for those that don't know you, they probably don't know that or even for those who do, they may not know that you're a basketball player, but I've seen you play, and I know that actually you're really good. So here it is, we're right around Halloween time. You got to have one of these 5 monsters on your team. Who's it going to be? We've got Frankenstein, Dracula, Chucky, Pennywise, and Reagan from The Exorcist. Who's it going to be?
Well, I think the SLU students would want me to answer the Reagan from The Exorcist because of
That's why I put her in there.
That's the connection to DeBerg. But I am a fantastic fan of. So the first one's Frankenstein. There's the Dracula. I'd probably choose Dracula. I find vampires fascinating. I think that there's something wonderful about the notion of sustaining and sort of being victim and being sustained by the fear of a vampire, of the mutability and interchange of blood, the relationship to the night. And none of this has to do with basketball, but I'm also kind of imagining Dracula dunking in the Cape, which would be visually very much a spectacle.
It would be. I think I'd have to go, for me personally, I would have to go with Frankenstein, because I'm thinking about that scene from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest where Chief is underneath the basket and just lays it right in every time.
Yeah.
That would be Frankenstein's job for me.
Nice. Brilliant. Yeah. I love it.
Well, I want to thank you for taking time out to do this. I've been wanting to set up this interview with you for a long time. And I love your book, and I would encourage people to go out and get Gold Cure, because it is a fantastic read. So that is it. This will be available in perpetuity at St. Louis University.
Awesome. Thank you, Ted, and thanks everybody for watching.
Thanks for being here.